The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. The committee is meeting today to examine current and evolving threats to the homeland. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. First, I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us here today and for offering their insights on the security challenges that we face at home and abroad. We'll cover a lot of ground today, from America's border security to our cyber defenses, but I want to focus in particular on the rising terror threat to the homeland. Last month, this committee held the first ever congressional hearing at the 9/11 Memorial Museum in New York. And on hallowed ground, we were reminded of the solemn pledge our country made in the aftermath to never let such a day happen again. That resolve became the rallying cry of this nation as we embarked on a generational war against Islamist terror. And 14 years later, we are still engaged in that struggle. Today, I expect an unvarnished assessment from our witnesses about where we stand in the fight. We are at a turning point in a new age of terror. I predict this year could exceed the last to become the most violent year on record for global terrorism. Radical Islamists are recruiting online, across borders, and at broadband speed, and the impact is being felt worldwide. Here in the United States, there have been more terrorist cases this year involving homegrown jihadists than any full year since 9/11. ISIS alone has inspired or directed 17 terror plots in America since early 2014, and overall the group has been linked to more than 60 plots against Western targets from Canada to Australia. The pace of terror plotting is unprecedented, unrivaled even by al-Qaeda at its peak. Yet we are no closer to dismantling ISIS than we were a year ago. Despite 14 months of airstrikes, the group has largely maintained its core safe haven while expanding its global footprint. The ISIS reign of terror is fueled by its recruitment of foreign fighters who hail from more than 100 countries, including our own. This committee launched a bipartisan task force to examine the foreign fighter threat, and last month the group released its final report with some very disturbing findings. Overall, they found that we are losing the struggle to stop Americans from traveling overseas to join jihadists. And we have only managed to stop a small fraction of the hundreds of Americans who have attempted to fight in Syria and Iraq. And some have even managed to make it back into the United States after enlisting with terrorist groups. We are falling behind the threat for many reasons. Vulnerable young people are being recruited at record speeds, and terrorists are shifting their communications to dark space, which has made it far more difficult to monitor and intercept suspects. These secure communication tools are also being used to plot attacks in our own country. Moreover, gaping security weaknesses overseas, especially in Europe, are making it easier for extremists to travel to and from the conflict zone. But at the end of the day, we cannot keep individuals from being lured to terrorist hotspots unless we eliminate the problem at its source. Sadly, those prospects have grown darker. The President's failure to develop a coherent strategy in Syria and Iraq has emboldened our adversaries to fill the vacuum with disastrous consequences. Russia and Iran are now propping up Assad, and there are reports that even Cuban special forces have joined the fight. Those rogue regimes will fan the flames of sectarianism and make it harder for us to eliminate the terrorist sanctuary in the region. Their actions will also intensify refugee flows, which have become a serious security challenge in light of reports that terrorists are exploiting the crisis to sneak operatives into the West. Violent extremists are also expanding their foothold from Libya to Afghanistan. Yet I am alarmed that we lack a clear vision for reversing their gains and winning the wider war against Islamist terror. If we fail to defeat our enemies overseas and combat them and their hateful ideology, we will be forced to fight more of them here at home. We've learned this the hard way. Today, I hope to hear from our witnesses about these challenges and how their agencies are working to strengthen our defenses on the home front. Again, I want to express my gratitude to each of you for your close and continuing cooperation with this committee, your dedication to our country, and your success this year in disrupting so many terrorist plots. And let me just close by saying that the FBI and Homeland working together have arrested almost 70 ISIS-related individuals in this country. I'm amazed at what we've been able to stop, and I just want to commend you for that. With that, the chair recognizes the ranking member.
I thank the chairman for holding today's hearing. Mr. Secretary, welcome to you. What is your first appearance before this committee, this Congress? I look forward to hearing your informed perspective on today's topic. I'd also like to thank the Director Rasmussen and Director Comley for their testimonies. Mr. Chairman, while I agree that the threats to this nation are concerning and worthy of examination, I also believe that as the authorizing committee of the Department of Homeland Security, it is our responsibility to hear from the Secretary about the overall management of DHS. This bipartisan committee, the Government Accountability Office, and the Inspector General have all identified challenges within the department. Additionally, there are components within the department that have proposed restructuring. While the Secretary's Unity of Effort initiative has made strides since the beginning of the Congress, but the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey still indicates that DHS has a long way to go in improving workforce morale. Also, two DHS components with a zero-fail mission, the Transportation Security Administration and the Secret Service, are ongoing, much-needed reform. Furthermore, the department's cyber mission is critical as we look to prevent crippling attacks from cyber terrorists. While we've heard from several DHS officials this Congress, we have yet to hear from the head of the agency on the record about how he's fulfilling his vision for the department and what he needs from Congress. Today's hearing and the topic and testimony does not provide for a hearing from the Secretary on the topics I've mentioned. Therefore, I'm asking you, Mr. Chairman, for a commitment at some point to hold a hearing on the oversight of the Department of Homeland Security and invite Secretary Johnson to testify before the end of the first session of Congress. I know the success of the department is a shared concern. Each member of this committee should have the opportunity to question the Secretary in an open setting and to continue to hold him accountable. Today's hearing on the worldwide threats gives the committee the opportunity to hear the perspective of top government officials on the wide-ranging threats of terrorism from both international groups and domestic terrorists. Through its oversight, this committee has given attention to the threat from international terror organizations, including Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula, and the threat from Islamic State of Iraq and Lebanon. The committee's bipartisan task force looked at the threat from foreign fighters, and one of their glaring yet unsurprising findings is that there are still intelligence and information sharing gaps that need to be addressed. These gaps also enter the conversation as we continue our efforts to address our humanitarian response to the refugee crisis in Syria. I want to hear from each witness about their agency's intelligence capability and how they are working together as we prepare to assist in this humanitarian crisis. As members of Congress, we have the responsibility to convey accurate information to our constituents and to the media. As we rightfully continue to address the threats from international terrorist organizations, I want to reemphasize that we should not lose sight of the threats posed by terrorists that are right here in America, as they are those that have no plans on traveling overseas to receive training from any international group. Through social media networks, ISIL has encouraged lone offenders to perpetrate violence right here on our soil. This approach is not novel. Right-wing domestic terrorist groups also use social media to recruit and communicate. Again, Mr. Chairman, violent extremists views no single ideology or recruitment tactic. Even though some federal officials have been dismissive of domestic terrorism and other generate false intelligence to the contrary, the facts are clear. Since September 11, more people in the United States have died in attacks by domestic extremists than attacks by international terrorist groups. Mr. Chairman, we often discuss what the 9/11 commissioners call a failure of imagination. As we use today to discuss the threats to our country, let us not fail to imagine the devastation that can be caused by the extremists, both abroad and in our backyards. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
I thank the ranking member, and I appreciate your bipartisan cooperation on the task force report, which I think was valuable, hopefully, to federal law enforcement and the intelligence community. And I will honor your request to have another hearing on the oversight issue as well. We have a distinguished panel before us. First, the Honorable Jay Johnson, who serves as the 4th Secretary of Homeland Security since his swearing in on December 23rd, 2013. Previously, he served as General Counsel for the Department of Defense, where he led over 10,000 civilian and military lawyers across the department and worked on the raid operation on the compound in Abbottabad to take down Osama bin Laden. Next, the Honorable Nicholas Rasmussen has served as a director of the National Counterterrorism Center since December 2014, served as the deputy director and as a member of the National Security Council staff, where he was special assistant to the president and senior director for counterterrorism. And finally, we have the Honorable James Comey, who has served as the Federal Bureau of Investigation's director since September of 2013. Previously, he was general counsel for Bridgewater Associates and deputy attorney general at the Department of Justice. He also worked on the exile program, which I remember meeting with you, sir, a long time ago when I was deputy attorney general for the state of Texas, trying to implement the same program in the state of Texas, and we thank you for being here as well. Witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Secretary Johnson for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Congressman Thompson, members of the committee, it is a pleasure to appear before you again. You have my prepared statement. I will not read it in its entirety. Let me just give you a few thoughts. Last month, I attended on 9/11 the ceremony that occurred in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. This was the 14th anniversary of 9/11. That ceremony in particular was a sobering reminder of the acts of terrorism, but also the acts of heroism that day, particularly on Flight 93, the 40 passengers and crew that day. I met almost all of their families that day. The events on 9/11 were the most prominent and devastating example of terrorist attacks by those who are recruited, trained, and directed overseas and exported to our homeland. The 9/11 hijackers were acting on orders from al-Qaeda's external operations chief, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was in turn carrying out the direction of Osama bin Laden. Likewise, the attempted shoe bomber in December 2001, the attempted underwear bomber in December 2009, the attempted Times Square car bombing in May 2010, and the attempted package bomb plot in October 2010 were all efforts to export terrorism to the United States, and they all appear to have been directed by a terrorist organization overseas. The response to these types of attacks and attempted attacks on our homeland was and is to take the fight directly to the terrorist organizations at locations overseas. But today, the global terrorist threat is more decentralized, more complex, and in many respects harder to detect. The new reality involves the potential for smaller-scale attacks by those who are either homegrown or home-based, not exported, and who are inspired by, but not necessarily directed by, a terrorist organization. Today, it is no longer necessary for terrorist organizations to personally recruit, train, and direct operatives overseas and in secret, and export them to the U.S. to commit a terrorist attack. Today, with new and skilled use of the Internet, terrorist organizations may publicly recruit and inspire individuals to conduct attacks within their own homelands. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula no longer hides the fact that it builds bombs. It publicizes its instruction manual in its magazine and publicly urges people to use it. Today, we are also concerned about foreign terrorist fighters who are answering public calls to leave their home countries in Europe and elsewhere to travel to Iraq and Syria and to take up the extremist fight there. Many of these individuals will return to their home countries with an extremist motive. In this regard, I compliment this committee for the report it issued on September 29th concerning foreign terrorist fighters. I have read it. I believe this committee's work is spot on in many respects in your assessments of the risk. As noted in the report, my department has undertaken much of what is recommended. We have been and are continuing to institute measures to detect and prevent travel by foreign terrorist fighters, along with the good work of the FBI. The recent wave of attacks and attempted attacks here and in Europe reflect the new reality of the global terrorist threat. The Boston Marathon bombing in April 2013, the attack on the War Memorial and Parliament building in Ottawa in October 2014, the attack on the Charlie Hebdo headquarters in Paris, France in January 2015, the attempted attack in Garland City, Texas in May 2015, and the attack that killed 5 U.S. service members in Chattanooga, Tennessee in July. What do these wave of attacks, recent attacks and attempted attacks, all have in common? They were all conducted by homegrown or home-based actors, and they all appear to have been inspired but not directed by Al-Qaeda or ISIL. Finally, we are concerned about domestic terrorism in the form of a lone wolf which can include various aspects of domestic terrorism, such as right-wing extremism. We devote substantial efforts to the study and understanding of these threats, and will continue to further our understanding of the underpinning of terrorist threats in all forms. In terms of what we are doing about it, I look forward to your questions. The last 2 thoughts I have, members of Congress ask me, what can we do to help? How can we support the Department's Homeland Security missions? Just 2 things I'd like to leave you with. First of all, through the work of this committee and the House passed H.R. 1731, which in my judgment is a solid cybersecurity piece of legislation. I hope it or something closely resembling it becomes law. I note that the Senate, with some manager's amendments, offered on the Senate floor the other day, S-754, which is the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. That bill, too, in its current form, is, in my judgment, a good piece of legislation. I hope the Senate takes it up on the Senate floor, passes it, and it goes to conference with the House's bill. And I want to thank the members of this committee who were leaders in that effort. We need cybersecurity legislation. Last thing I'll say, and this is probably the most important thing I can say by way of legislation, I cannot deliver for the American public the Homeland Security that the Congress expects of me and my department as long as I have to live with a sequestered budget. Unless Congress repeals sequestration, that will have very significant negative effects to our ability to deliver cybersecurity, border security, aviation security, maritime security, work with the FBI and others on our counterterrorism efforts, provide protection for our national leaders, and so forth. So I urge Congress to repeal sequestration so that we can do what we need to do for the American people. Homeland Security is the front line of national security. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. I certainly agree, and we need to reprioritize our budget towards national security and national defense. And on the cybersecurity bill, I'm glad we were able to enhance, I think, the Senate version more towards the House effort, and I think we'll have a successful conference committee. It's my great hope, and deliver for you so you can do a better job at that important effort. And finally, thank you for your recognition of the report itself and the task force. With that, Chair now recognizes Mr. Rasmussen.
Good morning, Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, and the committee members. Like Secretary Johnson and Director Comey, I welcome today's opportunity to discuss the range of threats to the homeland that concern us the most. But before getting into that threat picture in some detail, I want to stress that we at NCTC are very closely aligned with DHS, with FBI, and our other counterterrorism community and intelligence community partners in terms of how we view that threat environment. From an analytic perspective, I'd start by saying that the chances of a spectacular large-scale attack in the homeland by an overseas terrorist group have been substantially reduced over the last several years. And we've collectively achieved that outcome through aggressive CT action against al-Qaeda overseas and through the robust homeland security infrastructure that we've developed as a country in the last 14 years. But while we can look with some degree of satisfaction at the work done to reduce that threat of a large-scale mass casualty attack, there is still quite a bit to be concerned about on the current terrorism landscape. And that landscape, as you yourself said, Mr. Chairman, is in some ways more challenging than ever. It's also clear that the terrorist operating paradigm has shifted, and it has shifted in ways that are proving particularly challenging as we try to identify and disrupt potential threats to the homeland. Today, there are more threats originating in more places and involving a more diffuse and disparate set of individuals than at any time previously. Now, first, as you would expect, we are intensively focused on the threat from ISIL, which you highlighted in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman. In our judgment, ISIL has overtaken al-Qaeda as the leader of the global violent extremist movement, and the group views itself as being in direct conflict with the West. And that conflict is increasingly being played out not just in Iraq and Syria, but also in other places around the world where ISIL has declared itself to have a province. These places include Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan and Pakistan, Nigeria, the Caucasus region, potentially in Southeast Asia as well. And ISIL's aggressive growth and expansionist agenda has implications for us here at home in our homeland threat picture. And there are three especially concerning features of ISIL as a terrorist group, in my judgment. The first is their access to resources, extensive resources in terms of manpower, military materiel, and funds. The second concerning feature of ISIL is the territorial control the group exercises in Iraq and Syria, as well as in some of the provinces I mentioned a minute ago. And the third, again, is something that you highlighted in your remarks, Mr. Chairman, their access to a large pool of individuals from Western countries, both those who have traveled to Iraq and Syria and those who've remained in their home countries. And when we look for indicators of potential external operations capability that could threaten the homeland from ISIL, these are the key features we generally expect to see, and they are present with ISIL. Secretary Johnson also alluded to how we are coming to view the threat from ISIL, and especially the homeland piece of that threat. We've started to view ISIL's involvement in homeland attack activity as falling along a spectrum. At one end of that spectrum, we see isolated individuals who draw inspiration from ISIL's highly sophisticated media content, even if ISIL leadership is not directly guiding their actions. At the other end of the spectrum, something more traditional, we assess that there are individuals who may in fact receive direct guidance and specific direction from ISIL members. More often than not, individuals we see here in the homeland tend to operate somewhere between those two ends of the spectrum, creating a fluid picture that's difficult to assess. Second, if you look beyond our intensive focus on ISIL and the threat it poses to the homeland, we continue to devote substantial attention to al-Qaeda and its affiliates and nodes around the world. And despite the unrelenting media attention and focus on ISIL, in no respect would I or our intelligence community downgrade our attention on al-Qaeda-related threat activity focused in favor of greater focus on ISIL. In fact, when I'm often asked in public settings to identify what my #1 terrorism concern is, I decline to answer, because I would not want our focus on one terrorist threat to suggest that we are not focused on other significant threats that we are confronting. Specifically right now, we're closely watching for signs that core al-Qaeda's attack capability is potentially being restored ahead of the U.S. military's drawdown in Afghanistan. While the ability of al-Qaeda to train, recruit, and deploy operatives from their safe haven in South Asia has been degraded, we continue to watch for and track indications that core al-Qaeda is in fact engaged in plotting activity aimed at the homeland. In the statements for the record, both Director Comey and Secretary Johnson singled out al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula for particular attention, and that's for good reason. The threat from AQAP remains at the top of our list of analytic priorities, given the group's unrelenting focus on targeting U.S. interests, including potentially the aviation sector. Beyond Yemen, we've also been watching al-Qaeda's affiliated networks and individuals in Syria who may be looking to carry out external operations against the West or potentially the homeland. And while we've had some very public successes in terms of disrupting some of the individuals involved in that plotting from Syria, there's clearly more to be done in this regard, and the work continues. Our third area of priority, and my last area that I'll mention in my remarks, is the growing use of simple opportunity-driven attacks by homegrown violent extremists, what we call HVEs. That style of attack has clearly proliferated within the last several years. When you look back to 2009, we were seeing on average less than 2 or 3 of those incidents per year. By last year, 2014, that number was a dozen. And to date this year, that number of incidents or disrupted plots has already doubled for this year, suggesting that there are, in fact, a greater number of HVEs inside the United States pursuing potential attack plans. And while it's very difficult to put precise numbers on that population of homegrown violent extremists here in the United States, there's no question in my mind and in the mind of our analysts that this population has increased in size over the last 18 months. In my judgment, ISIL has injected new energy and life into that population of homegrown violent extremists. And ISIL, for its part, knows that it can have a real impact by motivating individuals to act in their own locations by carrying out individual attacks, even on a relatively modest scale. And that's particularly true if several such attacks were strung together in a compressed time frame. That's a significant innovation in the terrorist playbook, something that al-Qaeda never quite managed to deploy against us, and it requires that we in the counterterrorism community innovate and adapt as well. To conclude, Chairman and Congressman Thompson, I want to assure you and the rest of the committee that we continue to work every day to detect, defeat, and disrupt all manner of threats from across this full spectrum of terrorist concerns that we have. And I look forward to discussing these issues with you and the committee in greater depth.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate the work that you do. Chair now recognizes Mr. Comey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Thompson, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today. My colleagues have made clear in their opening statements something that I won't repeat, that ISIL has broken the model. I want to explain why that change in model leads us to talk so much about the challenges we face with encryption, very briefly. Social media has transformed human experience in wonderful ways. I have no idea where anybody from my 5th grade class at PS 16 in Yonkers, New York is today. My kids will know everything about everybody from their 5th grade class for the rest of their life. There's good and bad to that. I think on balance it's wonderful. But ISIL has used that ubiquitous social media to break the model and push into the United States, into the pocket, onto the mobile devices of troubled souls throughout our country in all 50 states, a twin message: come or kill, come or kill. Come to the so-called caliphate, live a life of glory, participate in the final battle between good and evil on God's side. Come to the caliphate, and if you can't come, kill where you are. Social media works to connect us. It works as a way to sell cars or shoes or a movie. It works to crowdsource terrorism. And so starting in the summer of 2014, they really invested in this, and it works. It led to troubled souls convincing themselves that there was meaning for them in Syria and Iraq, or that they should engage in acts of violence in the United States. And that investment started to pay dividends and taxed all of our resources in the spring of this year, when suddenly we had dozens and dozens of cases in the United States of people who were progressing along the spectrum from consuming to acting, to killing where they are. And thank goodness, thanks to tremendous work by the men and women who work for us, that was disrupted. We arrested dozens of people during this year to disrupt those plots. The challenge we face is enormous, because this broken model, this crowdsourcing of terrorism, means there are hundreds of people across our great country who are troubled, who are consuming this poison. We have investigations in all 50 states trying to understand, so where are they from consuming to acting? Very hard to find them and to evaluate them. And it gets harder still. It's not just a nationwide haystack where we're looking for needles. ISIL makes those needles disappear on us. because if they find a live one through Twitter, they will move them through all these investigations to an end-to-end mobile messaging app that is encrypted. And then the needle disappears. So we know if somebody's really dangerous to us, the needle goes invisible to us. That is very, very concerning. And the reason we are talking so much about encryption is we see in ISIL, and more broadly, a conflict between two values everybody in America cares about. We all care about safety and security on the internet. I and Nick and Jay are huge fans of encryption, right? We want our key data encrypted. It helps the FBI fight cyber intrusions. That value, safety and security, is colliding with public safety, which we all care deeply about. We don't have an easy answer, but a great democracy should see when its values are in collision and talk about how we might resolve those two things. There's no easy answer. The good news is we're having productive conversations with local law enforcement, which cares deeply about this, with our allies, and with the companies who make these devices and offer these services, because they are good folks who care about both values. This is a really hard problem for our country. We're not here to tell what the answer is. We're here just to tell folks. The example I use is the FBI is not an alien force imposed upon America from Mars, right? We belong to the American people. We have the tools the American people gave us through you. And our job, when one of those tools isn't working so much anymore, is to tell the American people. That's why we're talking so much about encryption. You see it in the ISIL cases, you see it in kidnapping cases, drug cases, child abuse cases. There is a conflict in our values that we simply must figure out how to resolve. It is obvious in the case of ISIL. We'll continue doing the work. I'm very grateful, as my colleagues are, for the high-quality product that this committee did on travelers, those responding to the first part of that siren song, that come. There's something interesting happening that I want to tell the committee about just in the last few months. We are seeing fewer people attempt to travel to join ISIL in Syria. We have seen 6 in the last 3.5 months. We were seeing 9 a month in all the months before that. I don't know what to make of that. One possibility is we're not seeing it the way we were before. They're still going. Another possibility is all of our efforts to lock people up and punish them for going is making a difference. Another difference is help from our colleagues around the world, especially the Turks, or something else. But we're starting to notice that curve, which was going up like a hockey stick, flatten a little bit. And we'll keep you posted on whether that continues. But this committee has done such great work on that topic, I wanted you to know that fact. We're very grateful for the opportunity for this conversation.
Thank you, Director. Chair now recognizes himself for questioning. And let me say on the encryption issue, dark space platform, this committee is, we are meeting with technology companies, trying to find a solution to that. You have the foreign fighter threat, but the threat over the internet's real. It's gone viral. I think the good news is Junaid Hussain was taken out by an airstrike. That's publicly reported, and has had some impact, I think. But it's going to continue until we find a solution, a technology solution. I also want to commend you for the success both you and the Secretary have had in stopping so many plots. We put out a monthly terror snapshot, and the fact is every month these numbers go up in terms of terror plots. We had 17 terror plots here in the United States, ISIS directed or inspired, and overall almost 70 ISIS-related individuals arrested. You don't know what you don't know. The Chattanooga case is a good example. You can't stop all this, and the chatter is so high, it's hard to stop all of it. And my first question, just very simply, is, and I'll direct it to the Secretary, is do you consider the threat environment to the Homeland to be one of the greatest since 9/11? Mike.
I tend not to rank threats or try to make an assessment that a current period is more or less dangerous than before, because we have to focus on a number of things. The point that I want to stress is that it's different. It's different than what it was in the 9/11 period, in that it's more decentralized and more diffuse. It's more complicated because of the going dark phenomenon, because of the very effective use of social media, and because of the potential for the lone actor who isn't necessarily exported from overseas, but who could strike here at any moment, which requires more complex response, a more whole-of-government response. We are very concerned. I'm encouraged by the numbers Jim cited of those we know about who've attempted to leave, but we also know that ISIL is still out there every day making an appeal. So we've got to stay busy.
Director Comey?
I think about it the way Jay does. In some ways, we are demonstrably safer, thanks to the work of this committee and the whole of government. Our country is better organized, better deployed, smarter, tougher than we were before 9/11. So as Director Rasmussen said, I agree that the threat of the big thing is not gone, but it is diminished significantly. At the same time, there's been a metastasis of the threat in all of the lightly governed or ungoverned spaces throughout the world. We're obviously all looking at Libya closely now and the Sinai and lots of other parts of the world. So it has become more diffuse. It moves at us faster through social media, and there's a whole lot more people in the United States energized, troubled souls than there were by core al-Qaeda at or after 9/11. So it is just very different today.
And Mr. Rasmussen?
The only thing I would add to that is that the diffusion and dispersal of the threat that all three of us have talked about creates a particular problem in that it stretches our resources that much more widely. The blanket has to cover more of the bed. When you look around the world at all of the locations, all of the safe haven locations, all of the regions of instability around the world where a potential terrorist threat might emanate from, are areas where we have to look to enhance our collection of intelligence, enhance our ability to partner with governments in those regions, and that's just a resource challenge. And if you think about the period dealing with core al-Qaeda, we were focused pretty intensively on Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now you could rattle off 12 or 15 countries where we're very, very active.
Yeah, it's more of a global movement. Let me move quickly. So the latest edition of Dabiq, which is ISIS's basically Inspire magazine, they discuss the idea of moving a weapon of mass destruction through transnational criminal organizations into the Western Hemisphere and across the southwest border from Mexico into the United States. Being from Texas, this certainly concerns me. And of course, not getting into specifics, but a plot was disrupted out of Moldova trying to smuggle two Islamist terror organizations nuclear materials that could have reached our shores. Director Comey, how serious do you take this threat?
Deadly seriously. I mean, this is something that we have worried about for a long time. We have a division of the FBI, the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate, where people wake up every single day worrying about this. It's one of the reasons that we have tried to build such good relationships with our law enforcement colleagues in so many of the places where there might be materials available, including former Soviet states. And so it is the classic extremely low probability, extraordinarily high impact event, and so it has our constant focus.
My final question is on the Syrian refugees. We've had testimony before this committee that we don't have intelligence on the ground in Syria. We can't properly vet these individuals through databases. We don't know who they are. I visited a camp in Jordan with some members on the committee, and we're told the same thing. I know the administration is planning on moving as high as 10,000 refugees into the country. Just very quickly, as my time is running out, how concerned are you from a security perspective on this? And do you think this will increase your counterterrorism caseload if we bring in 10,000 Syrians into the United States? Secretary Johnson.
Chairman, I am concerned that we do the proper security vetting for refugees we're bringing to this country. We've committed to 10,000, and I've committed that each one will receive a careful security vetting. It is true that we're not going to know a whole lot about a lot of the Syrians that come forth in this process, just given the nature of the situation. And so we are doing better at checking all the right databases in the law enforcement and intelligence communities than we used to. And so it's a good process and it's a thorough process, but that definitely is a challenge.
Director Comey.
I don't think I have anything to add to Jay. I think he describes it well. We see a risk there. We will work hard to mitigate it. Our challenge will be, as good as we have gotten ourselves at querying our holdings to understand somebody, if the person has never crossed our radar screen, there won't be anything to query against, and so we do see a risk there.
Well, for the record, we're a humanitarian nation. It's a humanitarian crisis, but we also have a responsibility to protect the American people, and to me, that's paramount as well. The chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Taking off from your question relative to the Syrian refugees, can each of you explain your agency's position on the vetting process for these refugees? A lot of us are concerned about whether or not you have enough information available to you to do an accurate vetting. And so, Mr. Rasmussen, can you?
Sure, I'm happy to start. As Director Comey suggested, we have a lot of lessons learned in this area from when we went through similar processes over the last several years dealing with other large refugee populations. And so I think we've now worked successfully to make sure that every bit of available intelligence information that the United States government holds will be looked at with respect to a potential nexus to someone being screened as a potential refugee. I certainly feel good about that process and the degree to which we've tightened that up over time. You can't account for what you don't know, and that goes to the intelligence deficit that I think is embedded in your question. What we can do, though, is understand where the potential vulnerabilities are so that we're asking in the screening and vetting process the right kinds of questions to give our screeners and vetters the best possible opportunity to make an informed judgment. It is not a perfect process. There is a degree of risk attached to any screening and vetting process. We look to manage that risk as best we can.
Mr. Secretary.
Each of us at the table here is acutely aware that in our world, one failure is the equivalent of 10,000 successes. And there are, in fact, lessons we learned from the vetting process with regard to the Iraqi refugees that we took in. The process has improved. We're better at connecting dots, checking the databases with information we have. My people in USCIS to do this will be on the ground in places to vet refugees along with the State Department, but they will do so in consultation with our law enforcement and our intelligence agency partners. And we will do it carefully. We've made this commitment, but we will commit the resources to do it, but we will do it carefully.
Mr. Director.
I don't think I have anything useful to add. I think my view are captured by what both the Secretary and the Director said.
So capsuling what's been said, it's your feeling that our existing systems are robust enough to assure this committee that, to the extent practical, no terrorist can get through that process?
Well, the issue we face, obviously, is what Jim mentioned, is we may have somebody who comes to us and is simply not on our radar for any discernible reason. And there may also be the possibility that somebody decides to do something bad after they've been admitted through the process. But we do have a good system in place for the undertaking that we've made.
Mr. Director, before this committee, Assistant Director Steinbeck said that the concerns in Syria is that we don't have the systems in place on the ground to collect the information to vet. That would be the concern. Databases don't hold the information on these individuals. Is that still the position of the department?
Yes, I think that's the challenge we're all talking about, is that we can only query against that which we have collected. And so if someone has never made a ripple in the pond in Syria in a way that would get their identity or their interests reflected in our database, we can query our database till the cows come home, but we're not going to, there'll be nothing show up because we have no record on that person. That's what Assistant Director Steinbach was talking about. You can only query what you've collected. And with respect to Iraqi refugees, we had far more in our databases because of our country's work there for a decade. This is a different situation.
Chair recognizes Mr. Smith from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to get some figures on the table. I understand the administration wants to admit about 15,000 Syrian refugees this year and as many as 25 to 30,000 next year. Is that generally correct?
The number this year is 10,000.
10,000. And then next year would be how many?
I don't believe that a firm decision has been made with respect to FY17, but this year we've said we want to take in 10,000.
It's been reported that there would be 2 to 3 times that many next year, much more of a significant increase. You've all used the word risk to describe admitting these refugees, and I assume that what we've heard and read is accurate, and that is that terrorist organizations are going to be tempted to try to infiltrate these refugees and try to sneak individuals into this country who might commit terrorist acts. I guess the question I have for you is how likely is it that terrorist organizations are going to try to take advantage of the admission of these refugees to get people in this country who might commit terrorist acts? Is it likely, not likely?
It's an intelligence question.
We've certainly seen terrorist groups think about exactly what you're describing, Mr. Smith, of trying to use available programs to get people not only into the United States, but into Western European countries as well. So we know that they aspire to do that. I don't know that I would go so far as to say they are likely to succeed because, again,
Is it possible to conduct background checks on these individuals, or is it only if they're already in the database that they would be flagged? In other words, a terrorist organization isn't going to try to get someone in as a refugee if they already have a public background that you would be able to uncover. They're going to get people in the country who have not yet committed a terrorist act. Don't you think it's likely that they're going to try to do that?
There is a pretty thorough vetting process of each individual, which encompasses a personal assessment of each individual, which includes an interview. It's not just simply what's in a public record. Does the person have a rap sheet of any kind? So there is that personal assessment.
That's a little bit of my concern. You're relying upon them and what they say or what they write out in an application, and you can't go beyond that. So you're sort of having to take their word for it. Another red flag to me is that in past years, historically, traditionally, refugees have been members of families. And yet the typical profile of a Syrian refugee, I am told, is that most are young single males as opposed to family members. And if so, to me, that would raise a red flag as well. Do you have any information or any comments about that?
Coming from me, sir, the one observation I have of resettled Syrian refugees in this country so far is that they tend to settle into communities that are that embrace them, that are very supportive in Syrian American communities around the country. I've seen that personally myself. It tends to be a pretty tight-knit, supportive community.
Okay. Well, as I say, both the profile and the motives of terrorist organizations and your admission that there's some risk involved, to me, would persuade the administration to go slow rather than fast when it comes to admitting individuals who might not, or who might do us harm. Secretary Johnson, let me move to another subject. The administration, this is more domestic concern. Administration has announced that next month it's going to release a number of thousands of individuals from federal prison. How many individuals is the projection who will be released next month? These are criminal aliens.
Well, the total number that the Department of Justice plans to release pursuant to their guidelines adjustment Next month, I'm told, is about 2,000.
2,000. And then how
Yes.
many of those individuals will be put into process to be removed?
A fair number, and this is something, let me stress, this is something that we've been working on now for about a year, and the thing that I'm focused on, that I have been focused on, of those who are released, who are undocumented, that they come directly into our custody, that they're not released to the streets.
Good.
So I believe that process, because I've checked numerous times, is in place, and that's exactly what is going to occur.
Good. Last time you appeared before this committee, I brought up the figure that the administration is releasing close to 30,000 people every year who have been in prison, been arrested, mostly convicted, and released them back out into our communities and neighborhoods. You said that figure was going to go down dramatically. It needed to stop. I've heard that for a couple of years now. Is the administration still releasing individuals back in our communities who are in the country illegally who have been convicted of crimes, or are those individuals being put into removal procedures now?
Well, Mr. Smith, as I'm sure you're aware, if someone is in immigration detention with a final order of removal, the law says that we have to do a 6-month assessment.
Right.
And if repatriation is not imminent, there are only limited circumstances under which we can hold them.
Right, but-
I have changed the process for deciding the circumstances under which that happens. We don't have the final numbers yet for FY15, but I believe that the number of those who have been released, who have been convicted of crimes, has gone down from 30,000.
To what number do you predict?
I don't have the number yet, but I'm told that it has gone down from 30,000. FY13, it was about 34, as I'm sure you'll recall.
Right.
14, it was about 30, and I believe the number is south of 30 for FY15.
I hope it's very far south of, of 30 for the sake of innocent American citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to state for the record that, ISIS has been on record through a smuggler stating they want to exploit the refugee process to infiltrate the West, and I take them at their word. So I would caution the administration to proceed very carefully in this program. Chair recognizes Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, and I want to thank witnesses for being here today and your testimony. I'm going to turn to another attack vector, and that's going back to the issue of cybersecurity, which we've referenced a couple of times here today. I thank the chairman for his leadership on this issue and the ranking member. Mr. Secretary, you referenced, and you've spoken about this before, the recent breach of OPM's networks and the role DHS has in protecting agency networks. And now I certainly understand that the leadership at OPM at the time was asleep at the switch and that they certainly ignored warnings from their own Inspector General. And I know that DHS can provide tools, Einstein, CDM, to assist agencies. So I have to ask you at this point for an update. Can you tell me with confidence that other agencies under your care will not suffer a breach like OPM's?
I can tell you that we're making rapid and significant progress to ensure that that does not happen. The Einstein 3A system right now, which has the ability to block intrusions, is available and deployed to about half the federal civilian government. I have directed my folks at DHS to make it available to 100% by the end of this year, and I believe we're on track to do that. We have gotten agency heads who, by law, are responsible for their own cybersecurity to focus on this issue. I issued a binding operational directive in May pursuant to authority given to me by the Congress to do that, which is in effect a scorecard to get agency heads to focus on this issue. And we have a very aggressive plan for enhancing our diagnostics ability. So I believe that awareness in these agencies has been enhanced significantly, including because of the OPM breach, and that we're on an aggressive timetable to, across the federal government, ensure that this kind of thing can't happen, or that the risk of it happening is significantly reduced.
So on the issue of binding operational directives, I want to know, I know this is authority pursuant to what Congress has authorized, but how does it work, and what are the consequences if a binding operational directive is ignored by the agency?
Well, basically, the way the authority works that Congress has given me, I have the ability to go to each agency and say, here are your vulnerabilities. You need to clean them up by a certain date. And if you don't, they'll be highlighted, and we'll have to follow up with you on this. And
So they'll be highlighted, but what does that mean? What's the consequence if they ignore your binding operation?
my recollection, and now I'm working on recollection, is that it means a report to Congress and a report to OMB. But I don't have the authority to simply do that job for an agency head myself, or in any way fine them or sanction them. But
That's
I
a
can focus
frustration
the
which
issue.
I've been talking about for a long time, that I think you or somebody needs that authority. Ms. Secretary, can you, before my time runs out, do you still believe that agencies should have primary responsibility for their network defense?
I believe that agency directors, administrators themselves should be principally responsible for their own networks. I also believe that DHS should have the overall responsibility for the security of the federal civilian.gov system, but that it should be on each agency head to take responsibility for his or her own network.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with on that you should have more responsibility than that and authority. Ms. Secretary, as you know, one of my chief concerns is protection of critical infrastructure from cyber attack. I think that all of us in this committee are aware of the threat that faced in cyberspace, and I'm curious about your take on the response of critical infrastructure owners and operators. In my experience, there has been a tendency to meet the minimum requirements put on them, but to ask the government to incentivize any measure taken beyond that. Do you believe owners and operators are innovating in their defensive efforts, or are they generally just getting by?
I think it depends on the size of the business and the segment they're in, but I believe that owners and operators of critical infrastructure are taking the threat more and more significantly because of the information we are sharing with them about what we are seeing, about some of the threats that have been directed to them. So I believe that there is an increasing awareness out there, and it's not just a minimalist approach.
Thank you. Director Comey, in your testimony, you referenced the steps the FBI is taking to continue to gather intelligence and stop terrorism despite the challenges of going dark. I share your concern. Can you expand on this beyond working with tech companies to address the problem directly and acknowledging that you're not asking for a legislative solution? What are the other methods FBI does employ?
Well, thank you, Congressman. When we face a needle that's gone invisible on us, we have to lean more heavily on traditional law enforcement techniques, see if we can get a source close to the person, see if we can get an undercover close to the person, see if physical surveillance tells us something about the person. And those there's obvious shortcomings in those techniques, but we're not going to stop trying to get the job done, and so we'll just lean on other things we've done for years. It'll be inadequate, frankly, but we'll keep working at it.
I thank the chair. This is an issue that I have increasing concern about, this going dark, and our intel and law enforcement's ability to really adequately see into the threats that are facing us, and it's a challenge that we're going to have to continue to confront.
Yeah, I share that concern as well. Chair recognizes Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Secretary, I share the concerns outlined by Mr. Smith about ISIL using the Syrian refugees that the President's decided to allow into this country as a vehicle to sneak bad actors in. You described a, quote, pretty thorough vetting process as a part of your response to his answer. Can you tell me more about that process?
Well, first of all, we're happy to brief you on the more sensitive aspects of it in a non-public setting, but it involves consulting a number of different agencies, law enforcement and intelligence, and the information that they have regarding each individual applicant. It is a more robust process than it used to be. To some, it is time-consuming, but it's something that I think we need to do. And it involves any information we may have. It may take some time to resolve any uncertainties about the information. Sometimes there may be a variance in a name or date of birth or something of that nature. But it involves consulting a number of different agencies as well as a personal interview and gathering simply as much information as we possibly have about the person.
I would appreciate it if you'd have your appropriate staff member schedule that brief for me in a skiff, and any other members of the committee that would like to participate. Director Comey, from personal experience, I have seen your agency do some phenomenal things with virtually no evidence other than a bad act to locate bad people. Having said that, I'm curious to know, is there any other tool that we could provide you, that Congress could provide you, that would help you locate these individuals that y'all referred to on social media that are recruiting and organizing in this country that you don't have at present?
I don't think so, Congressman. To me, this conversation about going dark is not about new authorities for the FBI. You have given us the authority to go to federal judges and make a showing of probable cause and get a search warrant or get an order to intercept communications. We think that's appropriate. We're big fans of the rule of law and the Bill of Rights, and so I think that's a good set of authorities. The challenge we face is solving the problems where those tools under the Fourth Amendment are no longer as effective as they were before, and that is this huge, knotty problem I'm talking about. So I don't see it as more authorities for the FBI. I see it as all of us together trying to figure out how the authorities we already have, the American people have given us, can be used to good effect.
You also made reference earlier, you and Secretary Johnson, about the surge of activity that you're having to manage now. Do you have the adequate resources to deal with that surge? I know Secretary Johnson has talked about sequestration and its burdens on his agency. What do you think about that? Do you have what you need?
The honest answer is I don't know. For this reason, I say that. If what we experienced in May, June, and into the early part of July were to become the new normal, it would really stretch the FBI. Because to meet that surge, we had to move a lot of folks from criminal work, because surveillance is only easy on TV. Following somebody 24/7 without them knowing you're there is really hard. And so we had to surge hundreds of people from criminal cases, which are important, move them over to the national security side. That bump in cases has dropped off a little bit. And so we're watching it very closely. We've moved people back to be able to do the criminal work. But if that surge becomes our new normal, then I'll have a different view of it. And I'll obviously make sure Congress knows the minute I've reached that conclusion.
Well, I hope you will. We want to be helpful. We want to give you the tools that you need. But frankly, we got to hear from you what you need. We can't help you unless you tell us what you need.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of the challenges that you described in terms of encryption and expanding social networking, I think one strategy is to maximize our other abilities to try and thwart terrorist acts. And along those lines, it's been a priority of mine, a priority of the committees, to look at enhancing information sharing among federal agencies and local law enforcement as well, particularly in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing. And I know that the FBI has moved forward in this, and I know that DHS has offered recommendations in this regard that we're reviewing here. If I could, Director Comey, if you could just give us an update on what you've done already in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing, use that as a time frame, and what you see going forward, and any timelines in pursuing that.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman Keating. I think we learned some good things for us to get better coming out of the Boston Marathon bombing. I appreciate your focus on it and the committees. I believe we're in a much better place today. We can always be better, but here's how I think about our improvement. We now make sure that everybody on the Joint Terrorism Task Force knows that our default is sharing information. And in particular, we want the leaders of the agencies represented in our Joint Terrorism Task Forces to understand that and actually participate in it. And so we do an inventory review in every single JTTF on a regular basis. Sometimes it's once a week, sometimes it's once a month. We want everybody to come in and sit down and say, this is the stuff we opened in the last month, this is the stuff we closed, questions, concerns, anybody want to follow up on it, so they are engaged at the JTTF, but also if there's something else they want to do in response to the inventory, they're able to do that. So I think we have pushed that both in letter, which is important, but in spirit, which frankly is more important, to understand everybody. We're in this together, especially this threat that is so spread out. We need state and local partners to spot this and stop it. So I think we're in a much better place than we were 2.5 years ago. As I said, I don't want to be overconfident, though. There's always ways to find ways to improve, but that's my sense of where we are.
I think all of your agencies have done an extraordinary job in thwarting so many potential terrorist threats. You've done a great job, if you use the analogy, of swatting mosquitoes. But the other thing we have to do is, particularly in light of some of our challenges, is to dry up the swamp as much as we can. And along those lines, I think it's very important work that DHS has done for the Office of Community Partnerships and making that the hub, the central point of trying to thwart some of these attacks. And I'd like to ask the Secretary Johnson, what's your progress in that? How do you value that? How is your funding for that? Because I'm concerned about some of that. And if you could, I think it's promising the peer-to-peer, if you could explain to the committee your progress with the peer-to-peer program, how that might be working, because it's important. We're a great country. No one, I don't think, has the resources to out-message us. But we're not maximizing on that, and that's important. So if you could comment on that, sir.
Thank you for that question. I have taken a great personal interest in countering violent extremism. I believe it is fundamental and indispensable to our overall efforts. So I've done a number of community engagements myself. The reason I created the Office for Community Partnerships is because I think we need to take our efforts to the next level. And so what this office does is consolidate in one place all the people across my department that are devoted to our CVE efforts. I want to build on that so that we have a field capability, and I want an office that will, in addition to engaging the community, also engage the tech sector, engage philanthropies, develop our own grant-making capabilities here. In terms of adequate funding, the single biggest thing that I'm going to keep coming back to in terms of adequacy of funding is please repeal sequestration. If I have to deal with sequestration, then I'm come up short on CVE and a lot of other things.
How about peer-to-peer? The peer-to-peer program, where you're engaging young people in terms of this messaging process. Could you comment on that briefly?
I think that among bright college-age people in particular lie the best ideas on CVE for the way forward. And so I've engaged several college organizations on helping us in our efforts. That's a work in progress. In my experience, young people, college-age people tend to approach CVE a little differently than older, more experienced people of their parents' age, which I can talk to you at greater detail offline about.
Yeah, and lastly, just a comment that the perimeters that your agencies have are important. That's why you're here. But if we're going to be successful, we're going to have to expand out beyond that in the nonprofit side, the public side, private side, and obtain more engagement. So I think that we shouldn't shortchange resources that all your agencies have to try and do that as well, because I think it's an important aspect. It's one that we still haven't maximized. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I want to commend the Secretary for adopting a lot of the provisions in the Combating Violent Extremism bill we marked up out of committee, and we appreciate that. Chair recognizes Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Johnson, the term OTM, other than Mexicans, is a DHS term, correct?
It's certainly a term we use around DHS.
Used by your field officers of people apprehended crossing the southern border that are not of Mexican descent?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to take all Latinos out, Guatemalans, Hondurans, El Salvadorans, all those out. There are other people that cross the border that are of African, Asian, and Middle Eastern descent. Am I not correct?
You are correct.
That are apprehended crossing the southern border. Okay, thank you.
You are absolutely correct.
Well, our southern border is not secure. We have no idea who's coming into this country. I could go on to Iran and Hezbollah and the tri-border region and the ties between Lebanon and Paraguay, the tri-border region there that the chairman and I investigated a number of years ago. But let me shift. We have no idea who's in this country. We have no idea who can come into this country through our southern border because it is not secure. Are you familiar with the Jewish museum that was shot up in Brussels in, I think, May or June of 2014?
Yes.
Okay. And that's for Director Comey, too. Several people died. The perpetrator was a foreign fighter who had been trained in Libya or Syria or Iraq, we're not sure, but he made his way back into Europe. And because of Schengen and open borders, he made his way to Brussels and killed several people and then fled, made it all the way to Marseille, France, was just about to jump out of Europe into Africa before he was apprehended. These are the facts. Foreign fighter flow is something we've got to be very, very serious about, especially because of open borders, especially because of the millions of middle-aged and young Middle Eastern men that have migrated to Europe, who could possibly have the ability to enter in this country because of open borders, visa waiver programs. It may not be this year, it might be 5 years after they get citizenship, whatever it takes. I will say this. I think the chairman misspoke a while ago when he used the number 10,000 immigrants coming into this country, refugees in the resettlement program. I've heard the number is 100,000 next year. Regardless, it's too many if we do not have the ability to properly vet those individuals. Some of those will come to South Carolina. I will tell you that the folks in South Carolina are very, very concerned about our inability to vet properly the refugees that are coming. I've been to the refugee camp in Jordan. I understand the immense challenge that we face from a humanitarian standpoint. I understand the need or desire for folks to leave the Middle East and travel to Europe or try to come to this country to try to create a better life for their family. I think the chairman spoke appropriately when he said we are a very humanitarian nation. History proves that. But we've got a different situation on our hands. We've got a group known as ISIS, and Al-Qaeda is still relative in this world as a threat to the United States, who want to come to this country, who have said they will exploit this refugee program to come to this country. And if they are able to make it to Europe, and they're able to jump to Africa and make it to South America or Latin America, because of our open borders issues, they could come across our border the way the OTMs are coming today. So, Mr. Comey, what can I tell folks in South Carolina about our vetting of these refugees that will put their minds to rest, that we are properly vetting everyone that may come into my state, that may wish to harm the United States? What can I tell them? Please share with me some bit of good news about this refugee resettlement program, because I'm not hearing it.
The good news is we're much better at doing it than we were 8 years ago. The bad news is there's no risk-free process.
So I hear interviews in the camps, in the refugee camps, but also hear that the records aren't there. So I just want to encourage you all, the three of you that are charged with national security of this country, to rethink the resettlement of refugees in this country, especially in the numbers that I'm hearing. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And
Chairman,
just,
can I?
yeah, point of clarification. I think it's important, and I think that's where you're going, because the public have thrown out the 100,000 number as Syrian refugees. My understanding is that there are 100,000 refugees total worldwide and 10,000 potentially from Syria, and maybe you want to clarify that.
What we have said is that for FY16, we will commit to resettling 10,000 Syrian refugees and a total worldwide of 85,000.
Okay. I just want to get that on the record.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, where do we anticipate those 85,000 coming from? Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya? Do we have any idea? Can we identify the countries that are being targeted for refugee resettlement?
Well, it's done by regions of the world, sir, and that is a publicly available fact, which we can get you. But refugees tend to come from every part of the world. Obviously, some more troubled places than others.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mrs. Watson Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. And thank you, gentlemen. I tell you, it's actually comforting to hear you refer to each other by first name. It means you are collaborating and cooperating, and it is good that there is a relationship there. It makes me feel a little bit better, although this is a very scary time. I have a few questions. I want to start with a question with you, Mr. Johnson. The United States Secret Service is leading an investigation of an online hacker that recently told the Washington Post he gained access to not only the CIA director's personal email accounts, but also to your own email account. Would you please describe what current plan is in place for the Secret Service to prevent this intrusion, given the external infiltrations the department has experienced recently, including the OPM data breach?
Ma'am, I don't think that I can comment about an ongoing investigation. The one thing I'll say is don't believe everything you read in the newspaper, because a lot of it is inaccurate. But there's a pending investigation by the FBI and the Secret Service, and so I don't think I can comment right now.
Okay, thank you. I am very interested in how we are approaching and looking at the security and safety threats to us. Obviously by those who are influenced or directed by foreign countries and jihadists, but also those who are our own homegrown right-wing extremists who wreak dangerous conditions upon unsuspecting and innocent people. And so I'd like to know from the three of you whether or not there's an assessment of a greater risk or equal risk or lower risk from one type of violent experience as opposed to the other, and what kind of resource application we have across the various entities that deal with both types, both the sort of right-wing extremists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Comey.
There are two parts to the FBI's counterterrorism division: international terrorism, domestic terrorism. We have hundreds and hundreds of people wake up every day worrying about domestic extremists, and by that I mean people who are not inspired or motivated by international terrorism organizations, but are people who see themselves as part of some political resistance movement or some racially motivated movement in the United States. And so we do a lot of work on that front. Our assessment of the threat is it's about the same as it was over the last couple of years, hasn't dropped, it's about the same. The international terrorism threat with respect to both that coming from the outside in and those motivated internally, as we've discussed here today, has changed and gone up, especially with those who are responding to ISIL's twin-prong message.
So for clarification purposes, though, is there any sort of ranking between the two types of violence?
There is not.
Is there a greater threat from the domestic right-wing extremist who's racist and anti-Semitic and all other things, as opposed to the jihadists inspired or directed?
We do not compare them in that way. That's sort of like, which do you like, dislike more, heart attacks or cancer?
Do you have
They
to
are
consider?
both very dangerous
But do
things
you,
that we focus a lot on.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I'm just trying to get at, is there a difference in the application of resources for one type versus the other? Are there the different offices in charge of one type or the other, or is there sort of a cross-pollination?
Well, there are, as I said, two divisions in the FBI's counterterrorism division. One focuses on the domestic terrorist threat, the other focuses on the international, including its manifestations inside the country. And then they talk to each other a lot. I've gotten briefings from them jointly, because they worry about whether there's any kind of crossover. But we think about them using the same kind of intelligence resources. We apply the same tools to understand presence on social media. And so we are addressing both as the serious threats that they are.
Are we collecting information on the type of violence that occurs, like that occurred at Mother Bethel Church? and around the country? Are we collecting that data and putting that into a database and sharing that so we have an understanding of those types of violent extremists?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson and Mr. Asmussen, do you care to comment on that at all?
I don't think there's anything I can add to what Jim said.
I agree, and actually, my mission area actually leaves me outside of the domestic terrorism, except for analytical purpose.
My last question is a really, really quick one. And I wasn't here, and I don't think you either were here, but do we have knowledge on whether or not we've had the same kind of angst and anxiety when there was resettlement from the Iraqi refugees? And do we find that that angst has been addressed? Have we found, learned lessons and done things differently? Thank you, and thank you, Mr.
Short
Chair.
answer is yes, we have. There have been lessons learned from the Iraqi refugee experience, which I believe have, and I think with the FBI, improved the process.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Clausen.
Thank you, Chairman, for your leadership here today, as always, and appreciate all three of y'all coming today and what you do for our country and the sacrifice you make, because it's not small. So I appreciate that. On a personal level, I get tired of the bad trade deals that our country makes. I get tired of our trading partners taking us to the cleaners. I get tired of good-paying American manufacturing jobs going overseas. And I'm like, this morning, if I'm the UAW, I'm not happy with the Chinese currency and their export subsidies. And if I'm Harley-Davidson, I'm probably not happy with where the yen is today. As we see our American manufacturing infrastructure get decimated, pretty soon we're just not going to make anything anymore. And what's wrong? Why not protect the American worker a little bit? On top of that, the Chinese hack us. Wait a minute, billions of dollars every month go to the Chinese in a trade deficit. They hack our companies, and they hack our government, and we just keep on trading. Now, as I understand it, Secretary Johnson, you said time will tell whether what we've done will keep them from hacking in the future. I say, why don't we protect the American worker, the American company, American unions, the UAW, and our infrastructure at the same time? Because if we put our markets on the table and said, any more hacking, you lose access to our retail markets, that would go away immediately because they depend on us to live. So while I watch our manufacturing sector get decimated and these folks hacking us, you're there with the administration. I just wonder why we don't use the obvious leverage that we have. It's obvious. And it makes me upset because I see so many of my friends and people I grew up with that lose good-paying American jobs. And you say only time will tell whether the Chinese are going to obey us or not, or cooperate or not, while we open up our markets. Am I missing something on my analysis of this situation, Secretary?
In response to cyber attacks on our government and on the private sector, there are a number of things, seen and unseen, that we have done and that we are considering. What I am referring to when I said time will tell, when the president of China was here and in the run-up to his visit, the Chinese government agreed that economic espionage and theft of commercial information for commercial purposes was wrong and was a crime. They agreed to that in writing, and time will tell whether they will live up to that agreement. But it was significant in the sense that they publicly, out of the mouth of their president, committed to that. But time will tell whether...
Have we ever talked, as the leadership of our country, of using the obvious market leverage that we have as almost a third of the global GDP and the source of economic growth for the whole world? Do we ever talk about using that leverage to get not only fair trade deals, but keep them from robbing our IP and keep them from hacking? I mean, we could stop it next month. Just shut down the retail markets to cheaters and let the American worker catch a break for once. all at the same
I have
time.
to refer you to other agencies of our government about that.
But you're up, I mean, look, you're part of the leadership structure, excuse me, but you're on the board of directors, you're at the chief, you're in the staff meetings, you know, and part of this touches you. I think if you were back in the private sector, the board of directors meeting, that answer might not be acceptable. I'm asking, does the senior leadership of our country, as we get taken to the cleaners on trade and on hacking and on IP, has anybody thought about using our markets as leverage? Do you all talk about that?
I suspect the answer is yes,
Well, then I'd like to see it a little bit.
but I again refer you to other agencies of our government.
Come on now.
Can give you an answer to that question.
You know, the American worker doesn't want referring to other agencies. Our IP, our folks that get their technology stolen don't want to get referred to other agencies. They want leadership. We're getting taken to the cleaners on 4 different fronts, and we don't want to get referred to an outside study. We want leadership for American jobs and American technology. I don't think that's too much to ask. You're part of the team. Help our countries, help our companies, and help our unions and our workers get a fair shake. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Ms. Jackson Lee.
Good morning. I thank the chairman very much and the ranking member for these important hearings on protecting the American people. And I want to pursue a line of questioning that sort of follows the opening statements that you gentlemen have made. I take from the director of the National Counterterrorism Center his sentence that said the array of extremist terrorists, actors around the globe is broader, wider, and deeper than it has been at any time since 9/11, and the threat landscape is less predictable. And I think that's an important sentence that has been really crafted and reinforced by the testimony and the leadership of all 3 of you, and I appreciate your service very much. I have introduced the no-fly for foreign terrorists I'd like to pursue, and starting with Director Coney, to reinforce the seriousness in which we should take, even though there's a lot of work, of individuals leaving the United States and potentially coming back to the United States, having gone to be part of the Caliphate or ISIL and to come back to the United States. What can you frame again how extensive that threat is?
Well, the returning terrorist fighter threat is what I understand you to be asking about, is one that we are watching very closely today. We see the logic of it telling us that's going to be a problem for the next 5 years plus, because not every terrorist is going to get killed on the battlefield in Syria and Iraq, so inevitably there will be a terrorist diaspora out of the so-called caliphate to Western Europe or to the United States. So it is a threat that all 3 of us and the people we represent think about every day, and also think about how it's going to manifest down the road.
Do you maintain a statement that you made a couple of weeks ago that there's a terrorist cell in almost, I think you said almost 50 or all 50 states that the FBI is aware of?
In all 50 states, we have open terrorism investigations related to a number of dimensions of the threat, but in all 50 states, we have ISIL radicalization cases under investigation.
And I understood you also to be a supporter of the concept of collecting data. I serve on another committee dealing with crime and terrorism and investigations, and my understanding is that you believe that we should be in the business of ensuring that data is collected sufficient for information on how to act on some of these issues of terrorism in particular.
I do. I'm a big supporter of the rule of law and using it to collect information that will help us keep people safe.
And I'm very glad that you said that. I'd like to add into the, when I say that, the rule of law, thank you, as I think that's an important point that people are concerned about, but I'd like to put into the record the no-fly for foreign fighters. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much. To the Secretary, let me first of all indicate that we are certainly concerned about the hacking incident, and I realize that it is under investigation. I'd asked this committee that we'd have an opportunity for a classified briefing, and I frankly apologize for you, a public servant, to have had that issue occur. But let me move forward to this issue of the power grid and cybersecurity, which I believe you have indicated that we need more legislation. You also indicated that we should get rid of sequester. Let me say that I support you, and many of us do. It's very hard to function. But I also would like to hear your comment about the power grid of the United States and the work that the Homeland Security Department is doing, the framework it's doing, and I'd like to commend you to some legislation that I'm going to offer into the record regarding focusing specifically on the power grids of the United States. Would you just respond to that? And I'd also like the Director of Counterterrorism to as well answer that and follow up by answering a question regarding the handle that we have on Syrian refugees that may be coming into the United States. And I want to thank the Secretary for coming to my district and having a very productive meeting with Syrian Americans, Syrians in Houston, who are open and welcoming those who may have to come out of persecution. Secretary?
With regard to cybersecurity, the two most significant things that we're hoping and need from Congress are provisions in law to encourage the private sector to share information with my department, cyber threat indicator information with my department. Sharing the information is vital to our Homeland Security efforts for the private sector and for the government sector. The other thing that is in pending legislation in now the House and Senate is something that explicitly authorizes the system we have for detecting, monitoring, and blocking unwanted intrusions, what is currently our Einstein system. And so those are two things in pending legislation that I think would be extremely helpful to our overall cybersecurity efforts.
And do you believe that, first of all, the idea of the cybersecurity issue is that a lot of the infrastructure is in the private sector? Is there enough collaboration, the private sector? When we think of power, we also think of water and other elements that serve the public. Is there enough of an element of collaboration to be able to put up that firewall of protecting a potential cyber threat or cyber terrorism?
There is not enough, and so we need to encourage more.
Thank you. Mr. Rasmussen, would you answer?
To your question, ma'am, on the degree to which terrorist organizations are interested in developing a cyber capability, they absolutely are. It is clearly a growth industry as far as terrorist organizations are concerned, and particularly ISIL. Thus far, the capability seems to be more evident at I would say, the low end of the spectrum. I don't mean low in terms of minimizing, but thus far, the kind of capability we've seen largely shows up in terms of pushing out people's publicly available or personal information in a public way, which is potentially very destructive. Their interest in attacking in a cyber way our electrical power grid or other forms of critical infrastructure we have. Thus far, we see that as more aspirational, not something where we see capability actually existing. But believe me, it's something we're very, very carefully watching because it's a way for a terrorist group to try to achieve widespread impact.
Well, let me, as I asked the chairman if I could put these items into the record, let me just say that we know that a number of terrorist incidences were aspirational 2 years ago, and I can't emphasize enough my concern on the cyber attack of the nation's power grid, and I don't think we're putting any extra information out, and I hope that all of you will focus very pointedly on that as a major concern. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to, and thank you very much for your testimony, yield back, but I'd like to ask the chairman to allow me to put into the record an article from the Hill regarding pushing to boost power grid defenses against ISIS, and also a CNN statement regarding ISIL is beginning to perpetrate cyber attacks. Ask unanimous consent for the record.
Without objection.
And to put into the record H.R. 85, ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
And ask to put into the record a letter to the President on encryption signed by over 100 individuals who are very concerned about any proposals that we don't oversee, even though I want to give tools appropriately, oversee in the right way to protect both the American people and follow the rule of law. Ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
And I have two more.
How many more do you have?
Just two more.
Okay.
The United States of America report on refugee resettlement and also analysis by top computer experts on encryption. I ask unanimous consent.
And without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Katko.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any reports to put into the record. I do have a report I want to talk about for a moment.
You may.
And that is the I was chair of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the report combating terrorism and foreign fighter travel, and I appreciate your comments. I'm proud of the work that our task force did, and many of my colleagues sitting here today were part of that task force, and it was done in a bipartisan manner. And when we did this over a 6-month period of time, we spent an extensive amount of time with folks from Homeland Security as well as FBI, and spent a lot of time with the National Counterterrorism Center as well. And we learned an awful lot. And I could be here all day asking you specifics about the report, but a couple of things I do want to touch on. In the wake of 9/11 and the 9/11 Commission, there was a legislation passed in 2006 to develop a national strategy to combat foreign fighter travel. The landscape has changed tremendously since then, as we all know, especially with respect to ISIS. One of the report's recommendations is to basically have an updated report of that, and I want to hear what your thoughts are on that, and all of you.
Congressman, in general, I do believe that we need a comprehensive strategy to foreign terrorist fighter travel. I also agree that since 2006, the threat has evolved enormously, particularly from European countries. We're concerned about those who have been to Syria and who come to this country from a country for which we do not require a visa, which is why, as you know, I announced a number of security enhancements with respect to travel from European countries to deal with this exact threat. But it is a significant problem, and I agree that we do have this in very large measure, but we should have a comprehensive overall strategy for dealing with it. We're doing a lot on my end. The FBI's are doing a lot on their end to interdict those who are leaving this country, who are going to Syria. But this is something that's going to be with us for a while. It also involves working with our friends and allies internationally, working with the government of Turkey, for example, which is something I'm personally focused on at the moment. Last thing I'll say, I read most of your report. I didn't get through all of it. I thought it was an excellent report. I complimented one of your staff on the elevator ride up here. I said, you wrote a great report. And he said,
That made his day, by the way, just so you know. That made his day. That complimenting the staffer, he appreciates that, so thank you.
Well, he pointed out to me it wasn't me, it was the members of Congress. So
And I appreciate that.
I thought you would.
Can I just add on to that, sir? The one thing we can be sure of is that today's conflict zone is obviously Iraq and Syria, where we're so heavily focused on foreign terrorist fighters. But we can be certain that there is likely around the corner in future years another conflict zone where foreign terrorist fighters will be a problem that we'll confront as a matter of national security. So I think some of the very things your report highlighted, the structures and procedures and capabilities we're putting in place to deal with this problem, don't necessarily give us immediate relief. They don't help us next month tell you that the flow of foreign fighters has been squashed or shut down. But I would argue, importantly, that we are building some capability that will bear out over time. Similarly, like what Secretary Johnson said, so much of the work on this problem is international work right now. And I would say that there's a good news story embedded in this problem, in that our foreign partners are far more willing to share information on this problem than would have been the case in 2006 or 2007 when we were dealing with the foreign terrorist fighter problem at that time. So again, the size of the problem, undoubtedly larger and more complex, but the array of resources we're able to call on around the globe, countries with whom you'd never think we would be working, we're exchanging successfully information on foreign terrorist fighters.
Right. It seems like the phenomenon, with respect to ISIS at least, and the radicalization of homegrown terrorists here, and getting them to go overseas to fight for them, is an added twist. And so I think that's something that probably warrants an update in the whole threat, in the whole terror travel analysis. Mr. Comey, I know you didn't have a chance to answer, but I do have a question for you that's different in nature, and given the short period of time I have, I'm concerned about the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, the JTTFs, and the stresses that are being put on them. You traditionally have investigated international and domestic terrorism as part of the JTTF. So to address a question that was brought earlier, the JTTF doesn't discriminate on which cases they look at. Whatever comes across their radar, whether it's a domestic case or an international case, gets a high priority. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And My concern is grafted on top of that now is this whole new phenomenon about ISIS and the stress that's putting on, both from foreign fighters coming back, having to expend all the capital and resources to track them, which is very difficult, as well as trying to find a needle in the haystack for those who are getting radicalized over the internet. So I know you touched on it, but I want to make sure we get a good understanding. Are the JTTFs being stressed beyond a breaking point, or are they okay, or do they need more help?
They're being stressed tremendously. As I said earlier, they were very, very stressed in May and June and early July in particular. But given your career experience, you know the kind of folks they are. They will just get the work done. What I want to make sure I do is, if we have a new normal, that we get them the plus up in resources they may need. I'm not in a position yet where I'm going to come back and ask for that, but it's something we watch very carefully.
Okay, and I understand that working together with the state and local authorities is helping you to leverage that, and I encourage what we can to keep that going, because that's a really important aspect of the puzzle. So thank you very much. I yield back my time.
Chair recognizes Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To FBI Director Comey, I want to thank you personally for the outreach that your LA office has done in my district. It was really important for me to ensure that we have a face behind that, phone number that we're supposed to be reporting issues of concern to. They've offered to do a follow-up in a more, law enforcement to law enforcement, because we did have members of the community at that hearing. So thank you for that work. In your testimony, we're talking about terrorist propaganda and the outreach that these terrorist groups are doing through social media. I'm very concerned about their infiltration with our local gangs. We have placed a lot of attention, and I congratulate all of you on the work that you're doing internationally. My concern is the Mexican mafia. My concern is the white supremacist groups that have targeted African American communities. And I want to ensure and be on record that we are doing everything that we can to also follow up on those issues.
Yes, Congressman, thank you for that. Those are an important part of the FBI's work with our local partners all day, every day. The gangs you mentioned, extremists that you mentioned. The Bureau was given the resources after September 11th to make sure we could be great at both our international terrorism responsibilities and these criminal responsibilities.
Earlier in your testimony, you said that due to sequestration, you have had to move people out of criminal investigations into to do surveillance work for these potential terrorist folks that go dark. That is why I bring that out to you.
Thank you. And I echo what my colleague Secretary Johnson said about sequestration. One of the reasons we've had to move those resources is we're trying to hire out of the hole that was left for us 2 years ago. And so we hired 2,000 people last year. We're going to hire close to 3,000 this year. And so we're trying to dig out of that hole and get us the people who can fill those slots. And if we get hit again, I don't know what we'll do.
And when we first met last year, I've asked you specifically about ensuring that you hire people that look like America, and that we are targeting areas where we need certain languages and certain ethnic backgrounds to be represented at the FBI table. How has your progress been on that?
It's probably too early to tell, but we're devoting a tremendous amount of effort to that, to trying to encourage people from all different backgrounds and walks of life to try to get into the FBI. It's not about lowering the standards. We don't need to lower the standards. We just need people to give us a chance. The obstacle we face, one of my daughters said to me, "Dad, the problem is you're the man." And I said, "Thank you." And she said, "I don't mean that as a good thing, Dad. You're the man. Nobody wants to work for the man. You've got to change the way they think about it." And so we're working very hard about that for folks to understand that the Bureau is a great place for people, whether Latino, African American, Asian, men or women, to work. And it's a work in progress. But I have 8 years left. So
Thank you. Mr. Rasmussen, you talked about a creation of a community engagement groups. How do you intend to do that, and who is the community? Who are the community partners that you will be inviting to participate?
In my written remarks, I highlighted the work we're doing at NCTC alongside Secretary Johnson's team and Director Comey's team. I'll tell you, though, in this effort to deal with countering violent extremism here inside the United States, it ends up being a separate and distinct conversation in almost every community. Because in each community in which we're working together, all of us, the community leadership looks different, the problem looks different, the set of actors who may have influence looks different, and that's what makes it hard. I think we're doing very good work in this area, but it's been hard to scale up because there's no national level solution, no single answer where you say if you just touch this in Los Angeles, it works in Dallas, or it works in Miami, or it works in
That's why it's so important to engage local law enforcement and to ensure that diversity is at the top of our priority.
I agree completely. And again, I wouldn't even suggest that we are bringing a solution to those local communities. In many cases, we're bringing information which will hopefully empower those communities to actually make the choices and the changes and take the steps necessary to deal with extremism in their midst. And that's not a federal solution.
Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Chair recognizes Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our distinguished panel for being here today. And I also, please tell the men and women that work for y'all, thank you on behalf of us as well. I spent 9 years as an undercover officer in the CIA. I was in the CIA when 9/11 happened, and to think that if you would have asked me then that there wouldn't be a major attack on our homeland for over 14 years, I would have said y'all are crazy. But we haven't had one because the men and women in y'all's organizations are working as if it's September 12th every single day in the operational discipline and tenacity that takes. I recognize that and understand that, and my hats go off to them. It's great representing the 23rd Congressional District of Texas, but it's also great representing those men and women that are doing that. I represent over 820 miles of the border. So Secretary Johnson, I'm here to report to you that you have some hardworking men and women in Border Patrol and Customs along that border. I had the awesome opportunity to award 3 of them with the Congressional Medal for valor. They went above and beyond during a flood. It read like straight out of a movie, and so I see what these men and women are doing every day. And one issue that they do have is, and don't need to address it here, but I'd like to work with your staff, and this probably impacts the FBI as well, Director Comey, and this is the right sizing of the federal fleet. I think GSA's requirements don't take into account the unique challenges that law enforcement has to deal with, and nor folks on the border. And so I look forward to working with whoever in y'all's office is on maybe this issue and looking at solving that problem with the GSA. And Secretary Johnson, I'm also interested in learning from your staff on how y'all calculate gotaways and that process, and that's something I'd welcome, a analysis of that from the correct folks on your team, if that's okay. And my first question to you, Secretary Johnson, is this cyber deal with China that was recently announced. Have we seen any impact that's having on attacks on our critical infrastructure from the Chinese?
I would say it's at this point too early to make an informed assessment. One thing that I will be looking to see is whether in our follow-up engagement, which I hope to have in December, we'll see real progress building on what we have agreed to on paper. And so that, to me, will be a first indicator of whether or not the Chinese are taking seriously what they agreed to do when they were here in September.
Excellent. And like you in your opening remarks, I hope the Senate sends us a bill so that we can reconcile those differences and get something to the President to sign, because cybersecurity is important. Director Comey, I appreciate your opening remarks, and you're stressing that the Bureau is not seeking any legislative issues regarding the going dark phenomenon or encryption, because there's still a perception out there amongst the private sector and privacy groups that the FBI is still looking for a back door or a front door to encryption. We all know that that's technically not able to do that. And if you allow the good guys to have access to the back door, then you're allowing the bad guys to have access to the back door. And my question, though, is when you have groups like ISIS using social media tools to increase their effort, doesn't that also give us an opportunity to increase our targeting of these groups?
Thank you, Congressman. First, with respect to your predicate, I honestly don't agree with your framing of it in terms of the encryption issue. I don't think there is a single it. Right? It's a very complicated technical landscape. I resist the term backdoor. I know it dominates the conversation today, but I don't know what the answer is. And I see lots of companies who are able to provide secure services to their customers, and they still comply with court orders. And so people tell me it's impossible. I'm a little.
Yeah, so here's my question, though. A lot of folks, I've sat down and talked with these people, and I've even talked with people in your organization about give me the use cases in which the case actually went cold. Because even if you have people using a device, you may not get the plain text information, but you do have the device. You do know that someone's using that. You do know the location of that device. So saying that you still can't target terrorists that way and throwing certain companies under the bus by saying they're not cooperating, I don't think that's an accurate portrayal of what's really going on.
Yeah, and I hope you didn't hear me to throw anybody under the bus. We're collecting, and we will get you hundreds and hundreds of cases, but to me that actually doesn't. I think everybody agrees the logic of encryption means that all of our work will be severely affected by it, but I don't think that's the end of the conversation. The question is, how much do we care about that, and what can we do about it? We will demonstrate the cases where it affects criminal work and intelligence work and national security work, but I don't think that ends the conversation.
100% agree, and I disagree a little bit with some of your opening remarks that there was a conflict in our values. I don't think there's a conflict of our values. Our civil liberties are the things that make our country great, and we can protect our civil liberties and our digital infrastructure and give our men and women that are working hard to keep us safe every single day the tools they need in order to continue to protect us in an increasing environment. I'm over my time. I look forward to working with you on this issue in the private sector because this is something that we can solve. I yield back, Chairman.
Chair recognizes our first female combat pilot, Ms. Martha McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony and the hard work of you and all of the men and women that are in your organizations. I was on the task force. I was proud to be on the task force, and certainly very eye-opening and troubling, but very important work for us to identify some of the challenges and the loopholes we have, which have been, further discussed in your testimony today, and look forward to working with you all to see how we can, obviously close those loopholes and increase our security. I want to specifically talk about the recruitment of women and girls. We've talked about, we think of there's over 250 maybe Americans have been recruited, over 2,500 Westerners. A lot of the men are being recruited to go over and join the caliphate and fight, but women and girls are being recruited to go over and basically be subjected to sexual slavery. A very different dynamic, and we've heard reports that the women and the girls, quite frankly, can't leave in the same freedom that some of the men do. So do any of you have comments about the different dynamic there, and then different efforts we would have in order to counter the violent extremism and the recruitment of women and girls?
It's a very good question, and what we do know is that ISIL does prioritize trying to recruit and bring young women to the caliphate. Yeah. They target some of their messaging directly to that community, and they adopt themes that they think will resonate with young women in Western Europe and even here in the United States. You'll probably remember not too long ago the New York Times ran a very disturbing series on the front page that described in some very vivid detail some of the horrific experiences young women have been put through by moving to the caliphate. And I was heartened to see that kind of information was becoming public, because it can only help to have that information exposed. But is the New York Times going to be the vehicle that reaches young women and explains to them how at risk they are if they respond to this call, or in the way that Director Comey described in his opening remarks, the way they gravitate, the way they might choose to gravitate towards the positive ends of this message? And I don't think the New York Times is going to be the vehicle that helps us explain that and create that sense of awareness that it's not the environment they're signing up for.
Right.
Congresswoman, I think a fundamental part of our CBE efforts here in this country is a message that has to be addressed to young women about the type of exploitation they could be subjected to if they go to these places, but I also believe it includes a message to their parents. as well.
I agree.
and
Thank
their
you.
family units.
Great, thanks. Moving on to a different topic, whether it's, we've had a lot of discussion today about vetting the refugees. We identified in the task force some challenges with visa waiver program, and just making sure, again, that we're keeping the country safe. One of the elements, we had a demonstration out of the university in my district, University of Arizona, related to deception detection technology. What we've learned in some of the briefings I've gotten is even with a face-to-face interview, you often could be wrong if someone is trying to deceive. And there's been decades of work done in identifying through neurological means and other things, whether somebody is deceiving, whether that's filling out online forms or in person. And we did give a demo to some individuals in your organization, but I'd really like to follow up with that because I think these are some cheap technologies that we could deploy that helps us in the vetting fight for a variety of different dynamics here. And I know some of your members were there, but it's sometimes difficult, bureaucratically to move technology quickly. So I'd really like to follow up with all of you related to this deception detection technology because I think it really would be helpful if you're open to it. Great, thank you. And then the last thing is, I ran a counterterrorism operations at AFRICOM in my last military assignment, and we talk about foreign fighters and foreign fighter training. Working with your organizations, we were watching thousands and thousands of terrorists being trained in al-Shabaab training camps, and we had the authorities, but we didn't really have the will to do anything about it. We're all talking about ISIS right now, but we do have AQIM, AQAP, al-Shabaab, certainly with the challenges with pulling out some forces in Yemen, limiting our intelligence. Just wanted some discussion on that so that we're not all focused on ISIL and not realize, I know your organizations are not, but I just want to hear your assessments of addressing the AQAP, AQIM, and al-Shabaab threats, and are there any similar issues that we don't have the will to be addressing those, or what other challenges are you having with those threats?
Thank you for raising that issue, because as you saw in my remarks, I resist a little bit the kind of gravitational pull that says that ISIL is the sole focus of our counterterrorism effort right now. It is certainly, as I said in my testimony, the group has surpassed al-Qaeda in terms of its prominence in leading a global jihadist movement. But in terms of the threat we face, each of the groups you rattled off, Congresswoman, very, very dangerous, lethal, and deserving of all of the resources and analysis we can bring to bear on it as a counterterrorism community. Simply as a matter of workforce management, I've had to resist the pull also to, again, surge analysts in the direction of only working on ISIL-related threats because of the array of other places around the world where al-Qaeda affiliate groups, and other extremist groups are potentially threatening us. So thank you for raising that.
Great, thanks. So my time's expired, but I look forward to following up with your organizations on those threats as well. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for all that you do to keep America safe. I'd like to go back to the issue in Syria that has displaced millions of folks seeking refugee status around the world. Obviously, it's a humanitarian concern for all of us. I'm certainly sympathetic to the atrocities there, and like many of the members have mentioned, appreciate our country's profound and long-time commitment to providing a place of security to those fleeing disastrous conflicts. That being said, I did want to drill down a little bit on the President's announcement a month ago of a 600% expansion in the number of Syrian refugees allowed into this country, going from about 1,600 a year to a figure of at least 10,000, as the President mentioned. I think, Secretary, you clarified that number today. So while humanitarian concerns are certainly warranted, we know that. I know that you would all agree with me that the President's actions certainly raise some real security risks here at home. Director Comey, you recently testified before the Senate that while we do have a robust screening process here, I think you did acknowledge that at the same time there are some information gaps in our databases that we use to screen these individuals. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. But again, I know you all agree that it's also vitally important that we understand who is coming into this country to the best of our ability, especially when we also know that ISIS has expressed an interest and an intent in using the refugee process to get in the United States. That's also a fact, isn't it, Director?
Yeah, I think Director Rasmussen testified to that just a few minutes ago.
All right. So with that in mind, I think we all agree that it's imperative these decisions be made on a humanitarian basis, but also with respect to national security in mind. And each of you and your respective teams are full of extremely talented, capable, dedicated folks that can inform these decisions. And so I want to find out the extent to which they were utilized. Was the figure announced by the President of 10,000, was that the product of a thorough analysis by your respective agencies? And I'll start with you, Secretary.
The announcement of 10,000 was the product of considerable interagency discussion. My department and USCIS was certainly consulted in arriving at that number. And it is, as I think you noted, very definitely striking a balance between what we know we can accomplish with the resources we have and not shutting our eyes and our doors to what is really a horrible world situation and doing our part to try to alleviate it. But yes, we were consulted, sir.
Terrific, thank you. Director Comey?
That's my understanding as well. There was an interagency process run through the National Security Council, and the FBI was a participant in those conversations.
Okay. Director Rasmussen?
And the same as well.
Okay. All right. Terrific. Thank you. Director Rasmussen, I want to talk to you a little bit. Back in June, we held a hearing at this committee called Terrorism Gone Viral, and it really examined the terrorist attack in Garland, Texas, which is just outside of my district, and related to ISIS's use of the social media, which is something that we've all talked about a lot today. In our June hearing, I really tried to get answers on the issue of why ISIS has been so skillful in this area relative to other foreign terrorist organizations. I asked about whether or not it was due to better funding or whether it was certain individuals within the group. And the responses I got were largely, well, the internet hadn't really developed when Al-Qaeda was going. Social media wasn't as pervasive until recently. But I think those responses ignore the fact that, at present, other terrorist organizations certainly exist, but it appears that ISIS still remains uniquely skilled in this area. So you gave some testimony recently in an exchange with Senator Johnson at the Homeland Security Committee in the Senate. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. And, maybe it relates to, I know there were reports in September that ISIS's social media activity seemed to ramp down following the death of Junaid Hussain. But I guess I want to know your opinion. Is ISIS unique in recruiting foreign fighters and inspiring lone wolf attackers? Is that a product of some unique capability that they have? And if not, are there other factors, or what are the other factors that make ISIS so skillful in this area?
I hesitate to use the word unique because the capabilities that they're using to mobilize potential fighters or terrorists, those aren't necessarily things that can't be transferred or adopted by other groups going forward. I think the innovation that ISIL as an organization undertook that differentiated it from Al-Qaeda in a significant way was that ISIL truly did aspire to be a mass movement. In creating the caliphate, the idea was to populate the caliphate with individuals from all around the world. Al-Qaeda traditionally and typically operated as a clandestine terrorist movement where vetting processes and letting individuals into the group was a very serious business. And so you did not see Al-Qaeda, I would argue they probably didn't have the tools to do this, but they were not seeking to create a mass organization capable of controlling territory the way in Iraq and Syria, the way ISIL has. So I would hate to rule out, though, or I would hesitate to rule out that other terrorist organizations could not adopt the same kinds of skillful techniques that ISIL has.
Thank you. I yield back.
I was just informed for the members that Director Comey has a hard stop at 12:30, so just maybe take that in consideration. Chair recognizes Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, my colleagues have articulated the incredible responsibility you all have protecting our country from domestic, homegrown, radicalized individuals to people who are overseas who want to attack our country, to fighting possible mass destruction of our country, to lone wolves shooting up people who are worshiping in a church in the South. Tremendous. I want to just touch on something no one's touched on yet, and that's the possibility of nuclear devices. Director Comey, your agents have done a remarkable job in thwarting smugglers from trying to equip ISIS with nuclear materials. Recently, one was reported, and I think there was 4 others or 5 others during the last few years. Are we getting some assistance from some of the former Soviet countries or Russia who also would be threatened by this? And what other materials possibly should we be looking towards other than just nuclear devices that certainly I know there are other materials that be harmful to our country, but what other materials are people like these ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other groups looking to use against our country?
Thank you, Congressman. The answer is we get cooperation across the board on this, because whatever people's political differences, everybody understands the threat posed by radiological, nuclear, chem or bio threats. And so we have invested as a country, and the FBI in particular, in building relationships with our counterparts in a whole host of Eastern European countries, the former Soviet states there. And so that is a good news story. The challenge we all face is, right, ISIL's mission is simply to kill a lot of people. And so they're not in love with any particular tool as long as it will kill people. And so we focus on, obviously, devices themselves, but also radiological materials that might, a cesium that might be used to terrify people or to injure people to long-term radiological illness. So there's a broad spectrum there. As I said earlier, we have folks in the FBI, and I know my partners here do, that wake up every day focused just on this because we see the threat as low probability, huge impact.
Thank you, my fellow New Yorker. And my other fellow New Yorker, Secretary Johnson, yesterday Congress passed a bill of mine to authorize securing the cities, a pilot program that your agency started back in 2006, very successful in New York, New Jersey region, expanded to Houston, LA, Long Beach area, DC. The efforts that you're making there, because we're expanding, do you have the resources to continue the success of that program in the future? Because it's been remarkably successful in our area where you and Director Comey and I come from, and the successes that we've heard from my colleagues are just remarkable. I'm sorry, Mr. Rasmussen. If you're not from New York, I'm not going to ask you a question. My time is up. Thank you. I yield the rest of my time, Chairman.
I thank you for that. Chair recognizes Mr. Richmond.
First of all, let me thank the chairman and the ranking member, and thank the witnesses who do a very difficult time in very difficult circumstances with ever-changing technology. I would hate to be in your job, but let me just ask, and I know there's a lot of talk about a number of issues, but I'm going to get a little local in my area because we do have the largest petrochemical footprint in the United States in my district, and we also have millions and millions of visitors that come, and then we also have the largest port complex in the United States in my district. So as you all share intelligence and as you all go about protecting the homeland, how worried are you all about our port security, our chemical facility security, our refinery security, and our ability to protect them?
Well, let me begin with that. New Orleans is a confluence of things that we in Homeland Security are concerned about, as you've laid out in your question, Congressman. And given the, and it's rightly on our radar, given the nature of the threat we face, it's difficult to rank with any real degree of certainty where we should focus on and where we should not focus on. For example, I think all of us would agree that prior to this summer, we didn't have any particular reason to put Chattanooga, Tennessee high on anybody's list. And so given the range of threats we face, we have to be vigilant in a bunch of different places, but certainly port security, maritime security, and the other things that converge in New Orleans are areas where I know many aspects of our department are focused in.
Mr. Comey.
Congressman, I don't think I have anything to add to what Jay said. It's a, because we have a lot of folks working in your district, it's a big focus of our work. We do face a large array of threats, but we try to focus resources on the big attractants for terrorist activity to try and make it harder for them. And a big piece of that is focusing on ports, on tourist locations, and on travel locations.
Let's spend just a quick second talking about the encryption and the back door. And I guess my question, and I guess it's a technical question, that if our tech companies create the back door, aren't there apps or over-the-counter things that would also allow people to encrypt it, or are you all pretty confident that you can access data through any over-the-counter encryption?
Thank you for that question. As I said to Congressman Hurd earlier, I resist the term backdoor because mostly I don't understand what it means. What we are looking for is a world in which, ideally, when judges issue court orders to search a device or to intercept communications, companies are able to comply with that. Today, lots of the most sophisticated internet service providers are able to comply. And their systems, no one's telling me, are fatally insecure, right? Some of the biggest email providers in the world, based in the United States, comply with our court orders. And so I actually don't think the problem is one of technology. I think it's one of business model, right? There's lots of companies who have said, we will never do this for the government. And so that's a problem we have to figure out how to solve. But here is the bad news. Commercially available encryption, strong encryption, we cannot break it. So we find ourselves getting court orders from judges. We make a showing of probable cause. Judge gives us permission for a limited period of time to intercept. We can't decrypt that data, and so we're out of luck. So we have to figure out other ways to try and make that gang case, that kidnapping case, or that terrorism case.
Thank you, and I see my time has expired. I'll yield back.
Mr. Barletta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This morning, the Daily Caller reported that the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia has indicted 2 senior NASA managers, NASA managers at the Langley Research Center for willfully violating national security regulations while allowing a visiting Chinese foreign national to gain complete and unrestricted access to the center. If this wasn't troubling enough, the article reports that in the wake of this case involving alleged espionage by a Chinese national, and now foreigners have more, not less, access to NASA operations at present. Before the Bo Jiang case, all foreign nationals, including green card holders, could be monitored and restricted. But now green card holders are treated like U.S. citizens with unrestricted access to all parts of the space research facility. It quotes a senior NASA official as saying, and I quote, "If you have a green card, your allegiance may still be to China, but the green card gets you legal authority to work in the United States. Therefore, we don't track them. They don't have any restrictions to transfer technology control plans. They're given access to the same exact way as a U.S. citizen because they have a green card," unquote. First, I'd like to commend Director Comey and the FBI for their role in pursuing this case over the last several years. But second, I'd like to ask the panel
whether this is common practice that non-U.S. citizens holding green cards but with sworn allegiance to other countries have the same access and privileges as a U.S. citizens at NASA centers and other facilities that may be of interest to foreign intelligence services, and if so, why?
I'm sure that Nick and Jim have their own answers to this. I will just say, I haven't read the particular article, Congressman, that you're referring to. I've been in countless places in government buildings, sensitive areas, where the sign says U.S. citizens only, who obviously have the requisite security clearances. I can't tell you the number of places where I see that. It's fairly common. I don't know about the particular circumstance that you're referring to there, but I'll be happy to refer to my friends here.
Congressman, obviously, because the case is pending, I'm not going to comment on the case. I thank you for the kind words about our folks who worked hard on it. I think the issue that you're talking about with NASA is about access by foreigners to unclassified information, right? As Secretary Johnson said, there's a whole regime that's very tight around what access foreigners might get to classified information. I think the issue there is when green card holders wander around a space that's not classified, what of America's information can they see there? And honestly, I'm not smart enough on the issue right now to talk to you about it in this forum, but it's something we have to get smarter about. Sure.
With respect to my organization, we operate in a highly classified environment, and any foreign national or non-security clearance holding individual would be required to be strictly escorted around our facility, again, as in any place in the intelligence community.
Do you think this committee should look at changing security laws and access by green card holders to bolster defense at these federal facilities, or are you satisfied with what we have in place?
I will answer with another that I don't know. Again, with respect to access to unclassified information, I don't know enough about the issue sitting here to offer you a view on it.
I'd have to give the same answer, sir.
Again, because I operate only in the classified space, so it's difficult to answer in the unclassified.
I'd like to thank all of you for your testimony today. It was very helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Loudermilk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm bringing up the rear here, and I first of all, thank you all for what you're doing to protect America. Very difficult time we live in. It seems like every committee, and I apologize I wasn't here for all the questioning. I listened to your statements, but another committee hearing dealing with vulnerabilities of our power grid. So it seems like most of the committees I'm on is something dealing with security. Question, I want to go back to the refugee situation. I apologize if I'm redundant on some of the questions. I don't think they've been asked, but concern I have, yes, we're a very humanitarian nation, and I think we do have some responsibility there, but our priority is securing this nation and the people of this nation. And I've read reports that of the Syrian refugees, 72% of them are young males, while 28% are women and children under the age of 11. Question I have for whoever has the information is, to your knowledge, is that true? And if it's not, what is the breakdown? And if it is, why is there such a disparity?
Congressman, I don't recall what the percentage breakdown is. I've heard a number, but I don't recall what it is. I don't know the accuracy of that 72-28% number, but we can certainly get you what we know to be the case.
Mr. Rasmussen?
I'm in the same position.
It is very concerning to me with that response that we're considering bringing in refugees, and we don't know what the breakdown of the percentage of these.
Well, sitting here, I don't know. It is a piece of data that we have. I just don't know it's sitting here right now.
I appreciate the candor there. How are we going to monitor these folks? I mean, I've also read reports that Al Qaeda, ISIS have also said that their intentions is to exploit this the refugee crisis and to use that to infiltrate operatives into various countries. I mean, how are we going to monitor these folks? Do we have plans going forward?
Congressman, as we discussed previously, there is that concern. We know that organizations such as ISIL might like to try to exploit this program. And it is for that reason that while we are going to do what we have committed to do for humanitarian reasons, this is a worldwide crisis. We're talking about 10,000 people. I'm committed that we do it carefully, and we vet these people as carefully as we can. We live in a world where one failure is the equivalent of 10,000 successes. And so I think we're all committed with the improved process we have to do the best we can, deliberately as we can, with regard to each individual applicant for refugee status here.
Do we have the resources to do this? Are we already stretched thin and we're just going to be adding so much more to our vulnerabilities by going through this process?
We are very busy. Our overall commitment in FY15 was 75,000 worldwide. Next year, this year, we've committed to taking in a little more, 85, 10,000 of which will be Syrians. The director of USCIS has developed a plan along with the State Department to make sure we have adequate resources to vet these people.
Of the last question, and I'll yield back. I know we all have other things need to be doing, but this is very critical. Do we have a system of prioritization? Like, we know that certain religious groups, Christians, for example, are the most at risk in some of these areas. Are we going to prioritize those that are greatest at risk to allow them in? I've read reports that some of the Christian Syrian refugees are having a difficult time coming to the U.S. and some other countries. Is that true?
I'd have to get back to you and take that one for the record, sir.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Again, thank you for what you're doing. Greatly concerned over where we're going with the refugee crisis. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, it's unfortunate the Gulf states have not agreed to take one Syrian refugee. They are Sunni Arabs, and those are Sunni Arab populations. They certainly have the wherewithal. But in closing, let me just say thank you to all three of you and to the men and women in your organizations who every day wake up to protect Americans from the threats that we face. And I think you've done an extraordinary job stopping so many of these threats, many that we know about and many that the American people don't know about. The challenges are enormous. And the threats are grave. But on behalf of the Congress, let me just say thank you again for what you do, day in and day out. With that, this committee stands adjourned.